Yeah, it tells me record.
Okay. Do you want to just check with the earphones one more time?
Sure.
To make sure that we've got that.
Go.
And I'm gonna, you know what, I'll just put that. I know it looks terrible, but it's actually sensible to me.
The earphones went to...
I don't know where they, maybe she
go?
tucked them away again?
Oh, there they are. Hiding in plain view. Okay.
Okay, so this is May 3rd, 2011 in Vancouver. Okay, so
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Loud and clear.
okay.
Okay, so I'll take
And Arthur
that
looks
out.
beautiful.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Okay, this is great.
Let's just make sure that your picture is level. We're good to go. I think that looks great.
Okay, you're comfortable? Yeah. Okay, great.
Alrighty, so just come get me if you need anything.
Okay.
And
Okay.
yeah.
You're in the same office.
Same
right?
office, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, see you later. Thanks so much.
No problem at all.
Okay, good. I actually kind of like this, just, yeah. So Arthur, if you don't mind, can you start off by saying your name and, you know, your birth, where you were born, and perhaps just bringing the story, just starting with that piece of a little bit of background about your life.
Okay. My name's Arthur Giovinazzo. Born and raised in southern Alberta, and came out to the lower mainland Vancouver area at the end of 1969.
And how old were you in 1969?
20. Yes, I was born in 1949, which is kind of neat to count up the decades. You know, I can always say I'm a child of the 40s, which I take certain pride in. So yeah, I came out here when I was roughly 20 years old, out to the lower mainland. And partly it was the time, and partly who I knew or got to know, but I pretty quickly became involved in a whole number of political, social action type of areas. But it was the time for that. You know, if we think back, there were some people who had read Betty Friedan and were very involved in thinking about issues around women and women's liberation as it came to be known and those sorts of things. Some people were coming at it from, they'd listened to Martin Luther King's speeches, and they were very concerned about racism and black liberation. And at the same time, there was also ferment around gay liberation. So all of these things were attracting slightly different subsets of people, but at the same time we were meeting each other and getting to know each other because there was some common causes that would come about in one way or another from those various interests. So here I am in Vancouver suddenly, and meeting a lot of very interesting people who were raising issues and putting out ideas of how we could do things differently. And it felt at the time, and still does feel like, it was a very exciting thing to be part of. And as a result of that, as I say, you know, you would meet people around a particular issue or a particular cause, or maybe just something as simple as a particular demonstration that you would attend. And one thing kind of led to another, so that within a year of being in Vancouver, I was very lucky to have gotten to know in some way a lot of, let's call them movers and shakers, but people who really were making things happen. So as I say, that was not only the feeling at the time, but reflecting back on it 40 years later, it was indeed an exciting, don't want to use the word revolutionary time, but certainly it was a time of ferment, and a lot of new ways of seeing things were starting to bubble up. And I think that everybody that I knew was in a sense following their nose. It's not so much that you had a clear idea of where you were headed, but you just, as things came up, got involved or not, depending on your own particular interests. So I wound up being most interested in a couple of areas, although I think not just myself, but all of us were aware that we were part of something bigger. That was I think, in everybody's consciousness.
So you got involved in a couple of areas.
Mm-hmm.
Gay activism?
Gay Liberation Front, and again, one of those things that I look back on now and I say, proud to say I was one of those people who called the first meeting of the Vancouver Gay Liberation Front, and that's one of the interesting things, because there was at each level, for people whose main focus was the anti-Vietnam War movement, there were certain key moments of things happening that seemed to energize people, energize the movement. Sometimes they weren't always good. The Kent State killings was a shocking event. But it did force people to look at certain realities of the way the system was, the way the system worked, and what we were up against. As I say again, for women, there were some key moments along that way. Certainly in the gay history, I don't think anybody can think about gay history without thinking of the Stonewall Riots. I mean, they've gone down in legend. But that was certainly on our mind here in Vancouver when my friend Gordon and a couple other people said, well, let's have a meeting, let's call a meeting and see who will come and focus on the liberation of gay people. And that was just the very fact that you could put out an invitation to people and have people come and share that experience of being gay was in a sense itself revolutionary, because for so many years, for so long, it had in fact been the kind of thing you didn't talk about.
Well, not in Lethbridge, Alberta.
Not in Lethbridge, Alberta, for sure. And those were extremely liberating. Just like on a personal note, for instance, before I came out to Vancouver, I had in early '69 hitchhiked my way from southern Alberta down to San Francisco. I just wanted to go see what all the fuss was about, you know? And when I remember this, stood on a street corner in San Francisco, and I had met this wonderful American guy from Kansas named Michael, and his sister, who was into Wiccan kind of witchcraft. But when we stood on a street corner and hugged and kissed, it was like so mind expanding in the way that just to realize, I can do this. And not only can I do it, but the very act of doing it is shattering taboos and barriers that needed to be shattered. So not only were you having a nice little romantic kiss, but you were making a revolutionary statement, so it was like a 2-for-1. But they were those things, and I don't think I was alone. I know I wasn't alone in feeling that so much of what we were doing was breaking through. And naturally it was, as I say, that was one of my interests.
Yes.
Gay liberation. But in doing that, then you would also meet other people, some who had a more of an interest in the legal aspects of things. So that was one way in which I met a woman who was responsible for the founding of the Vancouver People's Law School, and the idea there was to make people more aware of what their rights were, and look at ways in which we could use the legal system, which had so often previously been used against gays and women and blacks and etc., in ways in which we could turn that around and use the legal system to open things up for the purposes of liberation.
So Arthur, I want to just shift, because I wonder, all those things that you've talked about the breaking taboos, coming together, about this political personal fusion. So can you tell me how you came to be involved in the MPA? When did you first hear about it? What was your first encounter?
Well, and that takes us back to Lethbridge in a sense that I wasn't the only person from Lethbridge, Alberta, who was leaving our small town in southern Alberta and, in this case, coming out to the west coast. And one of those people was a good friend of mine from Lethbridge, Patty Servant. And it was Patty that told me that in the early 71, I do believe it was early in the year 1971, that there was this meeting. And it had certain similarities in a way that, some people have just decided to call a meeting. It's ex-mental patients and friends of ex-mental patients. And as I remember it, it was over on the west side of Vancouver, 10th and something. So we went to a house. I went with my friend Patty. And one of the most interesting things, back to how these different groupings of people kind of came together and reassembled themselves in various combinations, one of the people who had been at the founding of the Gay Liberation Front 4 months previously, lo and behold, he's there again at this meeting about MPA. It was Stan Persky. So that was my first introduction to MPA. And that's when I first met, got to know who Lanny Beckman was. And there were a number of other people who were really responsible for getting that going. But my personal history, at the same time, almost the same time, I had an opportunity to take some work with the federal government, which took me away from Vancouver, first to Edmonton and then Toronto, where I was quite involved in the federal government and a lot of their programs, which were aimed, and they had various names, everything from Katimavik, Opportunities for Youth, LIP, LEAP, but all of them in a sense had a common theme. It was the government kind of putting seed money out there to various communities. Partly in a way, I think, and it was a deliberate, if you think back to the people who were really making that happen, they were largely liberals from Quebec, liberals in the political party sense. Jacques Hébert, Jean Marchand, Gerard Pelletier, and of course, most famously, Pierre Trudeau. But they did have, they were making a deliberate attempt to give voice to various groupings in the community so that they could now be heard by the government. I think they were trying to expand the pool of information that came the way of the government. And of course, we all knew that large corporations or big media had the ear of government. And so there was a deliberate way in which they were wanting to make it possible for people who hadn't had their voices heard so much. So anyway, what that allowed me to do was get some insight on the funding of organizations, social action organizations, community-based organizations, how those sorts of groups, whether their main focus was fighting poverty or changing the status of women or dealing with issues around Aboriginal people, all of those things. There was a common thread, though, in which some of us were starting to get some clearer ideas about how we could use these various government programs to make things happen. And most importantly, to use the opportunity properly, to not waste it. Mm-hmm. But when I think back, there was there was a key moment in time, because most of that idea that I was just trying to express about the history of these people, and I threw out some names there that were trying to get this kind of focus going. Obviously, as we all remember, in late October of 1970, we had the Quebec kidnapping crisis, whatever, and what that did was shift a lot of the focus in Ottawa, and certainly among Francophones in Ottawa. They suddenly became very, very focused on and concerned about separatism. And so what that left was, they had started the ball rolling in a sense, but it now became clear that if that was going to continue and have some positive impact or effect, other people had to now pick up and run with the ball. So I did that for a couple of years, wound up coming back to Vancouver in mid-1973. But I came back with kind of a new skill set, that I did know something about, as I say, funding, government funding, access to government funding, what the criteria were for getting some of that funding, and what you were going to be judged upon in terms of people looking at you and deciding if you were a proper candidate for further funding or more funding, and all of those sorts of ideas. And like everything in politics and government and the world of research or whatever, it's important to know those things, because you have to present your case or lay out your purpose in a way that is going to resonate with people who have the ability to control that. So when I came back to Vancouver, MPA by this time had started to get rolling, and they were in fact accessing many of these same programs that I just talked about. But when I got back, as I say, in mid-73 or so, in my memory, Barry Cool, another name, was very, very much a person who was acting as kind of a central command at MPA in terms of understanding what these programs were and how to access them or whatever. The first housing had been started. And again, I'm sure there were other people involved. It's just that from my perspective, Barry seemed to be the person who was coordinating a lot of those efforts to use central mortgage and housing programs, social housing programs, provincial and city of Vancouver funding, to put together, as I say, the first MPA residential houses, drop-in center, etc. And so I got my first job at MPA because it came through my friend Patty. In early 1974, there was a position came open. One of the houses needed another coordinator, and I ran for the position. And when I say ran, I don't know if it's entirely clear to people how one got involved with MPA. It wasn't a matter of handing in a resume to somebody or that sort of a thing. And this was one of the exciting, humbling, but exciting things about MPA, because to get a job at MPA, to get my first job working in a house, I had to first of all get to know the people who were living in the house and other members of MPA, many of whom came to MPA as ex-patients. You had to talk to those people and explain why you wanted to become involved. And those people had to vote you in. It was an election. The purest, in a sense, to this day, and I am a pretty political person, but the purest form of democracy. And as I say, it was kind of humbling and unbelievably nerve-wracking. I suppose it always is when you kind of put yourself out there. But you would go and sit in this room, and my memory was it was mostly members of the House, up at 15 to 20 people. And there's no room for glibness or trickery in that. It's pure in the sense that you are just in a room face to face, and there's no BS and no pretense or whatever. You are literally quite naked in front of people. And that's one thing that I learned very early. Maybe because of the experience of being a patient. It's very, very perceptive. I always felt whenever I was running for any job at MPA, I felt like I had the world's most informed and astute electorate sitting in front of me. They knew what they wanted. They had a pretty good idea of who you were. It was a very, very honest, you know what I mean? Very emotionally honest process. So I got up my first job, and you didn't get a job for life at MPA. Every 6 months, you had to do that again. You had to sit down in front of these people and account for the job you had done, explain why you wanted to continue doing the job. And, you know, I think it's a term that's become overworked in a lot of ways, but you got feedback. You want feedback? Go to one of those MPA meetings in the 70s. And it wasn't I'm not saying it was feedback in the sense of cruel or mean or anything like that, but people just gave you absolutely honest, unvarnished feedback on their perception of you or their perception of your commitments to MPA's ideals, or it just had that absolutely open and honest feel to it. So here I am now, and I'm working at MPA and feeling very, very much a part of a group. Because to be part of MPA was to not just work at the house you were working at. You would spend a lot of time at the drop-in center for various reasons. Our office was also there, so you would be going back and forth. You would be meeting people, sitting down, playing Scrabble, playing cards, going for walks, and in that process talking over not just issues specific to MPA, but all of the things that affected the lives of people who were largely poor. I don't know a lot of rich ex-mental patients. So you would be dealing with just the issues that presented themselves to people who were trying to live their life in the community. And of course, MPA housing was all about working with people who had sometimes years of experience in an institutional setting where they didn't make a lot of their own choices and they didn't have a lot of control of their own lives. So MPA's job, as I saw it, and I think I shared this as an ideal with others, was to break the cycle of institutionalization in a sense. First by saying to people, you don't have to feel diminished or in some way lesser than because of your experience in the mental health system, because you've been diagnosed as or labeled as psychiatric patient, that doesn't mean something negative. And that may sound trite now, but it was a very big important part of our work to establish the idea that there was nothing wrong with us collectively and us individually as part of that group. So there was and we all did that for each other. And that was one of the things, like, you just felt at MPA, and in this way it was a little different than a lot of the other kind of leftish or progressive groupings that I had some connection with. MPA was an encompassing, MPA was a supportive, MPA was a grouping that, well, not almost, it was a family. You became part of the MPA family. With all of the ups and downs and ins and outs that families typically create. It doesn't mean there wasn't, strife or tension or things didn't have to be argued out, which they were. But that's how you lasted or whatever at MPA. You truly became part of this larger group. And when you were part of that group, as I say, you had safe places to go to, drop-in centers, houses, meetings, gatherings at other places, restaurants, bars, or whatever, where people would get together. And you looked forward to those things. But that's as I say, looking back all these years, I see myself as being very fortunate as to one of the people who was not an ex-mental patient, so in that sense was a friend of patients. I was one of those who was honored to be brought in to the group, totally embraced by the group. And it was something that we always talked about at MPA, but it was absolutely true and is true to this day. The only difference between you and me, if you were talking about a conversation between an ex-mental patient and a non-ex-mental patient, the only difference between you and me is at some moment in time somebody stuck a label on you and they missed me. That we didn't see those differentiations. We didn't see that wall or that division being the same way. And it was emotionally satisfying, intellectually challenging, because there was all kinds of amazing ideas coming up through the organization. So you did wind up feeling, boy, I'm part of something good. I'm doing good work. I'm surrounded by some of the most interesting people that I've ever met. So all of that really had a way of grabbing hold of myself, I can speak for. And I saw that happening with other people that you really, really wanted.
So Arthur, if you were, king of the world, what would you, and you got to or play God or whatever, what pieces of the MPA do you think should be reincarnated and given to people with mental health difficulties today?
The number one would have to be the process itself. How we ran our organization. It was open and it was democratic in the true sense of the word. Everything was decided by the group. We had, and I remember the time sometimes you'd complain about it, oh my God, another meeting. We had a business meeting every Tuesday, which would always have 30, 40, 50, 60, depending on the day and if there was certain issues coming up. Every Tuesday, every week of the year, a business meeting. And that's where literally everything was decided. What we would spend money on, who we'd find to carry the insurance on our houses, if we were going to buy a new van, where we'd get it, like everything from the mundane to the philosophical. And then once a month, on a Wednesday night, we'd have a general meeting. And as I was telling you, every 6 months at one of those general meetings, that would be also election night. So what you had was a room filled with people. If it was a business meeting, as I say, 40, 50, 60. At a general meeting, it could be 100 and more people. A very large number of whom were ex-mental patients. But they were in a room now suddenly, surrounded by friends, caring people, understanding people. So the people who had previously been too intimidated or shy or whatever to express themselves or speak up, that was not a barrier at MPA. People who, and that was one of the things too, people had patience. If you had to take 5 minutes to say something at MPA because you were nervous or shy or whatever, you were given that 5 minutes and you were given that encouragement. So I really remember that as those meetings, now that I have had time to reflect, they were the heart and soul of MPA. And you had such a mix, as I say, of people like myself coming into the organization outside of the psychiatric mental health system. And you had some very powerful thinkers, intellectuals, who had had the experience of being a mental patient. And certain names that, you know, come to me, and I know that they've, in your looking at the organization, those names have come forward, whether it's Patty Servant or Dave Beamish or Jackie Hoop. But there was many people, and MPA gave them a place where you could stand up and say things and challenge and ask questions and get explanations, and it was truly a glorious process. It was, as I say, the very essence of MPA, and it bonded us together, because you would, as the weeks went by and these business meetings came and went and the general meetings came and went, there was a group of 60 or 80 or 100 people who had shared those meetings and what had come out of them and the decisions that had been made. And much as I say, as in any organization, in any meeting, people have differences of opinion and sometimes tempers flare and all those things. But I was at MPA for many years, and I always felt that the group feeling, or the feeling that you were part of MPA and the bonds that you had with MPA were far, far stronger than any disagreements or whatever you might have had over particular issues with particular people at the time. I was just always had a feeling of intense pride that I was part of it, and thankfulness that so many of these people had invited me in.
So, and then the MPA started to change. So can you tell me a bit about the changes when the funding shifted? And
right, so we've talked a little bit about MPA gets started, and because they've got a few people with those kinds of skills to write grant applications or whatever, to get some money going and some programs rolling. But as the 70s progressed, 3, 4, 5, a lot of those early federal government programs, as I say, for one thing, the federal government's focus had shifted to Quebec separation type issues. So a lot of the federal programs, whether it was LIP or LEAP or OFY or whatever, they were never meant to be permanent funding. And so we started to hear from these people, okay, we're going to give you X dollars over the next 2 years, but that's it. So, one hand, MPA had started some houses which required ongoing funding to make them work. And we had a drop-in center, and we had other programs underway that required funding. And we'd been given plenty of lead time. Told, I mean, sometimes 2 years ahead of time. Sometimes, at the best, LEAP was a 3-year. So you knew, okay, we're covered now, but we got to make a plan. So that required MPA to, as you say, start making, I don't look at it so much as changes as choices, because changes implies that we were here and then we had to suddenly or whatever go over there. whereas I saw it as a process of responding to circumstances. And from that point of view, I don't think I'd be wrong to say that there never was a grand master plan about how it was going to turn out anyway. So whatever evolved and turned out, to my mind, that was, in a sense, what was meant to be. It's not different than what somebody else had envisioned, because nobody, as I say, had ever laid it out and said in 1971, oh, in 10 years' time, this is what it's going to look like. We didn't know. And part of the glory of that whole democratic process was battling it out as we went. But the issue became, central issue became, as we started to look at what our ongoing funding options would be, it became crystal clear that that meant going to the province, provincial government, for ongoing program funding. And that's because the province is responsible for health care under the Canadian Constitution. It's largely a provincial thing, as is most social policy. So, and the feds had said to us, okay, here's this funding, but you got to find something permanent. So we now know if we're going to keep this going, let's talk specifically about the housing program, which was a big component of MPA's programming. By 1976 or 7, we were up to 5 houses, which were housing, let's say, 50 people, roughly, which had a staff of 10, plus an office staff, etc. That started to become a fairly large program. What are our options? Provincial. So then we had to start having conversations with the provincial government. Well, what are your funding criteria? And will you look at funding MPA? And if you're going to look at it, what do we need to know about what you're looking at? You know, we have to understand what you want to see. And partly because it was just MPA's nature to be open. There was nothing hidden agenda or underhanded about MPA. It just wasn't in MPA's DNA to be like that. Everything was out in the open. And it was, some of these very, very thoughtful people who did see what the potential danger would be, that this structure that MPA put in place, this democratic, open structure, everybody can speak to every issue and you're going to be listened to, and at the end of the day, it gets voted on. There's nobody in charge, there's no board of directors, there's no president, whatever. We, the group, and it's a shifting group. The same 60 people that were there at the Tuesday meeting 3 weeks ago might be slightly different than this group. But it was open and it was understood how decisions were made. It became clear pretty quickly that might become a bit of an issue from some of the funders' points of view. Because funding agencies, government departments, tended to want to have a more traditional structure in place if they were going to be handing out significant amounts of money. So what we wound up with was a 4 or 5 year process in which MPA was becoming better known by the decision makers at the funding end. Some of them were civil servants, senior civil servants in the health and social services and welfare departments. So MPA was becoming better known, and MPA was also getting more of a grip on what the possibilities were for us as a group in terms of our housing program and other programs we wanted to put in place. But as I look back on it, I personally don't think that it required MPA to lose its focus or its true meaning. I think there was a way in which we were able to, as we went through these meetings and talked about our new relationships with various government departments, we were able to, I see it as evolve the organization in such a way that it met the requirements of the check writers, the funders. But to my mind, and I can only speak up until roughly 1980, but I think it did it in such a way that we not only kept some of the ideals and the ambitions and the goals of the MPA as it was founded, but we were also able to, and I don't think enough people appreciate this, change the consciousness of these senior civil servants or politicians, so that by 1980, those power brokers, or whatever you want to call them, were also looking at things differently. Most of them, if you think about it, I mean, people who were senior civil servants in 1977 or 8 or 9, and making decisions about MPA, well, most of their training and life experience and whatever had been forged in pre-1970. So these people, along with MPA members, had come out of a system where it was big institutions and a certain mental health model and all of that. But I also saw that some of them were also open to alternatives. You know what I mean? They it wasn't a case of us and them, like, oh, we at MPA want to challenge or bring new views to things and talk about looking at things differently, and somehow you're the keepers of the old way. I found that they were learning from MPA as we were learning from them. So it was a real back and forth, and that's one of the hidden things that MPA did. It's hard to quantify, but at least in the BC context, MPA changed the way politicians and civil servants and care providers were looking at what they did. So there was movement for sure. Did MPA change? Did it move along the way? Well, of course it did. That's the evolution of anything. But I think, to my mind, at the end of the day, the programs continued, the housing continued, so that ex-patients and current patients and people in need of those services had them. They might not have had them previously, or only had them, and that's what we were talking about. Before that, if you were a mental patient, you were housed at Riverview. Now there was alternatives, and they were community-based alternatives. And the housing program was being run in ways that explored new possibilities. And the other thing that had also happened was that the MPA programs, as they proved themselves, affected what other people were doing, whether that was other service organizations, Coast Foundation, Canadian Mental Health, whatever. They were learning and sharing our experience. So I do see it as, over that crucial period of time, 74 to 80 or whatever, through a series of steps and negotiations and hard-fought discussions at MPA meetings, what we wound up with was an ongoing, well-respected service organization that I think still is very aware, and I have no intimate connection with the MPA of today, but my sense is that at some level they're very aware of where they came from, what the evolution is, and I think that can only be to the good.
Hi, Arthur, I want to just hear a little bit more from you, because this is something that I haven't heard before, and I think I was really interested in your point about the impact that the MPA had on people within the provincial health and social welfare bureaucracies. But you also just lightly touched on that same point relating to other service and community mental health organizations. So can you give me a bit more on the impact the MPA had on people in the provincial bureaucracies and service organizations? Tell me a little bit of that story.
Okay, so as I became more involved with MPA and got away from being a housing coordinator and a position to open up because Barry Cool had sort of left the organization. So anyway, I was now in a position of doing a lot more meeting with funders, city, Vancouver, provincial government. So I was in a position to see and get a lot of feedback, from people about how they were perceiving MPA. The first thing that I remember feeling on a consistent basis at different contexts was how MPA had destigmatized, or was in the process of destigmatizing, I don't know if that's the right word, but there had been a certain negative connotation always to psychiatric patient or having been a patient, and it was kind of one of those shameful things like gayness that you didn't really talk about. But MPA helped to change that. It no longer was such a terrible thing at all to say, yeah, I was a mental patient. I had a breakdown, I had an episode, or I'm prone to depression or schizophrenia or whatever it might be. And history moves fairly slowly, but MPA started that conversation. It was okay to now talk publicly about mental health issues and mental illness itself. That was something that didn't really get talked about in the 50s and 60s, and it was kind of hidden away, like the patients themselves in the big institutions on the hill. So it suddenly became more acceptable to identify and bring up those issues. But it also, the very fact that people were now listening to self-identified people who might say, oh, I was an ex-mental patient, and they were realizing that, this person had something to say, something important to say, and it was making people think, as I say, and I don't want to throw out any particular names, but I can think of a couple of people who were very senior in the provincial government's bureaucracy that dealt with health and mental health. People clearly expressing the idea that they had changed the way they saw things, that they were growing along with MPA, that it wasn't a one-sided process at all. So MPA was crucial in helping both mental patients see themselves in a better context and getting rid of that stigma that was happening on that end. But on this end, as that conversation went on, it was helping people who hadn't really understood what it was like to start to understand. And that's the point of any dialogue, isn't it? I mean, that is essentially that's how social change comes about. It starts with that conversation. It starts with that dialogue. And MPA got in the door. MPA got invited to the meetings, and MPA kept that conversation going, and that was something I think that again came from that MPA structure. Once we were in the door or at the meeting, it wasn't that we suddenly stopped talking about what was important to us. We did raise the issues, and we did offend sometimes. You know, it's not easy to tell somebody what you've been doing for 30 years isn't working. That can be a difficult conversation to have. But we were in a position to have it because we were constantly, as that process played out, we were earning the respect of other people. As I say, organizations, Canadian Mental Health, or the Coast Foundation, or bureaucrats, we were earning their respect and changing how they saw things. And that's why I say, I don't think there was ever a grand master plan for MPA, except if there was, to my mind, it would have been something like, we want to find a way where people who've had some experience as a psychiatric patient see that as a not shameful and in fact sometimes downright positive experience. We're not going to let ourselves be either feel internally like there's something wrong with us, and we're not going to let our voices be shut down and in its own slow and erratic path through. For that 10 years of time, 1970 to 80, my personal experience with MPA was the vehicle that made all that happen. That gave voice to the patients, that got enough credibility so that others were forced to listen, and at the same time was developing actually hard on-the-ground services that were available to patients. So if you ask me, all in all, you know, you could say, well, are there things that you wish had turned out differently or whatever, and I suppose you could, but all in all, pretty good record. That was a lot that got done in a relatively short period of time, and it was done by a group of people, a shifting, changing, wonderful family of people that self-identified as MPA, and all of those people, whatever the part they played, should be, I think, proud of what they did and what they accomplished.
I think so too. I have a few, you've touched on a lot of different points here, very articulate, but I have a couple of things that I wanted to specifically ask you about, and one of them is about Lanny. Now, when you came to the MPA, Lanny at that point wasn't around as much anymore. But
when I came to work, you mean?
Yeah.
Kind of the second time, yes. He was there at that first meeting, but by 1974, Lanny was a respected name, essentially, but he wasn't day-to-day actively involved in what MPA, the ball in that sense, to my mind, had been passed to Barry Cool, let's say, who was kind of the leading figure at that point.
But tell me about, why was he respected? What did Lanny bring to the MPA?
Well, I think just the very idea of it. The very idea of it. If I can paraphrase it, and I'm sure, and I know for sure that Lanny is much more articulate and has written and spoken much better than I can put it, but here you've got a man who had a psychiatric experience. That is, he was diagnosed or labeled or whatever, wound up in the system. Came out of that and was one of the first, and maybe the first for our purposes, the first to say, I'm not ashamed of that. I'm going to talk about it. And some of that experience, I didn't really like how it played out. So I'm going to talk about it, and then I'm going to find other people, and we're going to change the way things are done. We're going to change how people look at a psychiatric patient. And that in itself was a revolutionary statement. Like, somebody's got to be the first one to stand up. You know, like that famous scene in the movie Spartacus. And the Roman goes, oh, who's Spartacus? Because we're going to hang the bastard or whatever. And slowly people started standing up. I'm Spartacus. My name is Spartacus. But somebody has to be the first one to stand up and say, Me, I'll speak up for, in this case, in mental patients, psychiatric patients. But in that way, it was no different than the women's revolution, the black revolution, whatever. So smaller scale, yes, but we all know, okay, Martin Luther King played a crucial role in the discussions about racism in the United States. Betty Friedan played a certain role in the women's liberation movement. Lanny Beckman played a role. Lanny Beckman spoke up. Lanny Beckman called a meeting. Lanny Beckman got some of his friends to join him in the struggle. That in itself, to my mind, marks him out, and this word gets so overused these days, as a hero. Because it can be years and years in which people quietly accept a kind of oppression. Can't really do anything about it, don't make a fuss, all of that kind of thing. And then somebody comes along and says, no, I'm going to make a fuss. Yeah, I'm going to make a fuss. I'm going to speak about it, especially if they've got some eloquence about them, which he did. Again, it's like every person brings a skill set, but because Lanny had some training and skills that allowed him to articulate and write and explain himself, and because, again, personal history, he had some friends and associates and people that he could call on, so he became just the spark that lit the little fire, and the little fire became a rather impressive thing. So that's how I see Lanny and Lanny's contribution. You could say, maybe it would have happened on a different time frame, but from our point of view, no Lanny Beckman, no MPA. That's as simple as that. And again, as I say, I cannot, obviously wouldn't dream of trying to speak for him, but I don't think there was, as I've tried to express it, a grand master plan. The plan was, let's do something. Let's do something about it. Let's start talking about it. Let's get the conversation going. And if that was the plan, which I think was the plan, such as it is, bravo. Amazingly successful, because it is now an ongoing conversation. And here 40 years later, even outside of the MPA context, you just have to listen to CBC radio or whatever. Mental health issues and treatment of mental health, treatment of people with mental illness is a conversation that you can now have in any level of society, in any circle, government, academic, whatever. And I am absolutely convinced that that conversation would not be the same today if it had not been for Lanny Beckman. And now, there are other figures and there was other people working in other cities, but
it started here in Vancouver.
It did.
Yes.
It did. There's no question about it.
So, Arthur, I want you to, now I know it's a long time ago, but can you describe that first meeting?
The very first meeting? First thing I was surprised at, because when my friend Patty goes, we're going to have some ex-mental patients at a meeting. I go, well, this is going to be a small crowd. But I remember a packed room. I remember maybe 15, 20 people. I remember something that was a little different. Most of the meetings that I would have gone to back in 1970, being roughly speaking a leftist, mostly you would go, it would be a fairly young demographic. The first thing I noticed at the MPA meeting, there was men and women of all ages. So I go, okay. And immediately, or by the end of that meeting, I knew that 5 or 6 of those people who I'd never met before were there because they had been institutionalized at some point. So to me, that made me feel like, and I was deliberately trying not to be condescending in any way. And I don't know why, but just intuitively I felt like that was an important process for me to go through. But by the end of the meeting, it was clear to me that I didn't have to struggle much with that anymore, because the people I heard speaking had something to say. So that's what I came away with. Was I was surprised at how well attended the meeting was, impressed with the breadth of the demographic. It wasn't a narrow group of people, or kind of a self-referential thing at all. And there were some interesting ideas being talked about. So that's what I came away with from that first meeting. And after that, I was not nearly so involved, but I would hear about MPA and what it was up to through Patty Servant, who I think is, again, one of those people who, if not for Patty Servant and D.B. Mission, Lanny and Barry or whatever, one of those absolutely key figures that made it happen and was there in some capacity through that whole 10 or 11 year process.
Yeah.
So that's what I came away with, thinking, I didn't go with any kind of negative feeling, of going oh yeah, sure, this is gonna work. But I didn't expect to come away with the feeling that I did, which was, wow, these guys, they've got something going on. And in that way, it was like that Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song. Something happening here, and what it is ain't exactly clear. But you knew something's going on here, and something good's going on here. So that's what I came away with.
That's cool. Okay, so I've got a few other things. I want a bit more stuff on In a Nutshell.
Funny, I was just going to bring up In a Nutshell.
Okay.
Patty, back to Patty. That was one of the things that Patty really did a lot of work on. She did. Didn't matter whether it was layout, writing, photographs, whatever. One of the people who, a lot of those issues in a nutshell would frankly not have come out if it hadn't been for the effort of 2 or 3 or 4 people who were willing to stay up till midnight and etc. and do it. The first thing I loved about the nutshell was that wonderful little play on the New York Times thing that they came up with. Because I think in the New York Times, it's all the news that's fit to print. And MPA's take on that was all the fits that's news to print. Okay, clever, I just thought that was perfect. And it was true, in essence, because the nutshell was a paper, ink, black and white manifestation of Lanny's idea. It's a voice. That's what a newspaper is. It's out there. People can pick it up or get handed one or read it. And people would. They pick it up. Oh, what's this? In a nutshell, do. And it is written, produced, focused on, and about mental health, mental patients, psychiatry, psychiatric abuse, psychiatric use. It was all in there. And from an intellectual point of view, some very challenging stuff was in some of those early nutshells. Questions about electroshock therapy, which was still widely used. I mean, I know it's still used, period, but was very widely used at the time and probably widely misused. But in the nutshell, I remember well-argued, strong points of view challenging that as one issue. So it wasn't like some kind of light, fluffy, coffee corner type newspaper. It had substance. You know what I mean? It wasn't a just a fun and whatever. It did have some funny stuff in it, and it had some poetry, and it had some artwork, and it had the kinds of things that any group of people is going to want to contribute. But it had some intellectual heft to it also. And I do know that I would run across friends of mine who had no connection otherwise with MPA, who had actually read the Nutshell. And because they had a sort of a different take on it or whatever, became engaged in some of those issues around, because think about some of the issues that were circulating in the world of mental health at the time. One, the big picture about institutionalization, deinstitutionalization, community-based care, that conversation. I just mentioned electroshock therapy. Two, and I think it was 1972, is gayness a mental illness or isn't it? And which is actually, if you think about it, that goes to the absolute core of the question. Because if one day you and I can sit down, call ourselves the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and announce that gayness is a mental illness, and then a couple days later sit down and say, oh no, we changed our minds, it's not a mental illness anymore. Well, it tells you that there's a certain arbitrariness to it on the big scale. Is it going to be put in the compendium of syndromes or not? That's the big picture. But it's also on an individual basis. Like, if I look at you and say, you're a mental patient, you've got a psychiatric problem. Oh, sorry, changed my mind. You don't have one anymore. There's an arbitrariness to it. So we used to call it labeling, and I know other people have used that term. But that was a big issue at MPA. Because the first thing is somebody says, oh, you're a mental patient. Your answer is, says who? Well, sorry, excuse me, who gave you the right to go hanging the labels on? If you want to come over to me and say, you're nuts. Well, excuse me, why can't I turn it back on you and go, no, you're nuts. Now who's going to decide? We've got a disagreement here. You say it's me, I say it's you. So that also, and the MPA wasn't afraid to do that. And sometimes we, not me personally, but we at MPA did use, like back to that simple thing, all the fits that's news to print. Clever, but it just turned it around. It just flipped it. Oh yeah? Okay, well let's just play with that for a second. So, Nutshell in a sense was the visible black and white printed voice of MPA questioning things. And it wasn't so much that it was a complete, well thought out, coherent, whatever. No, depending on the issue and who wrote, whether, if Kathy Frank contributed something, or Patty, or Jackie, or whoever was doing some of that would affect what that issue raised, but it did. And I have no idea in my memory how many we used to print or whatever those, but sometimes in the strangest places you'd walk in somewhere and there'd be a nutshell. There's a copy of the Nutshell. It's somewhere, you know what I mean, like far removed from the MPA drop-in center or the MPA house. It might be Student Union building out at UBC, or up at SFU, or at Co-op Radio, or, all kinds of places. So it was getting circulated, it was getting read, and my memory also is that in not too long a time, nutshells were being mailed out to people all throughout North America, certainly across the United States. And because people wanted to know, well, what are those crazy people in Vancouver talking about anyway? Which was kind of, neat, because crazy can be a semi-complimentary pejorative word. In this case, it had a double meaning, like
and
crazy.
The other thing, as a writer, I can imagine how it would have felt for people to publish something.
Oh yeah. Again, for some people, for many people, they could write something and they had the satisfaction of getting the respect, because to some extent, that's one of the, the very first things that comes into play with becoming a mental patient, getting diagnosed as a mental patient. So it's like Rodney Dangerfield, can't get no respect. Yeah, because somehow your words don't have enough validity or whatever, because it's crazy talk or something. But Nutshell did. It turned that around, and it gave first the voice, but most importantly, it gave legitimacy to the voice. It was a voice that was taken seriously. And that's again to the point of, you'd see it in interesting places, copies of it, or it was being mailed out to people who were actually reading it and thinking about it. So it had that double purpose of people who hadn't had anything published, period, suddenly could submit an article, get it published. Largely, if there was any editing or whatever going on, it was strictly from, just let me help you out with a bit of wording. Nobody was attempting at any stage to, no, you can't say that. I think of any publication I've ever been associated with, Nutshell there was no walls or barriers in that way. You could call it the way you wanted to. And then with that, A, the freedom to do it, and then B, people listening to you, and you would actually get feedback. So can you imagine for somebody who'd felt all along, which people do anyway, I mean, all kinds of people, is anybody listening to me, and am I the only one who thinks like this, and I'm crazy? Those are thoughts that all of us have at different times, right? And so here was people being able to put stuff out there and get feedback saying, no, it's not just you, and that's not such a crazy thing to say, and thank you for saying it. Very important for many people that the Nutshell came into existence, gave voice to the organization, and spread the word out there. It did. It was part of Vancouver's scene.
And they're beautiful. It's a beautiful publication, right?
Yeah.
Like the graphics and everything.
No, it was well done.
So I wanted to ask you about the world of the drop-in.
Oh, the drop-in. Well, as a month ago when you were here and we got a chance to go to the old drop-in. And I thought about it later. It was kind of nice to go and stuff. But seeing it as it is now, yes, the physical plant is there and you can go to but it doesn't capture what the MPA drop-in center was. A lot of people use the word drop-in center, and I think it has a certain implication. The MPA was the most successful drop-in center I ever saw targeted to anybody, and because I've seen, women's drop-in, Aboriginal people's drop-ins, etc., because it was alive, and it was open, and it was welcoming, and it was fun, and it was funny, and it was, so it was a combination kind of like of, you could, or certainly me, because I always felt totally accepted at MPA. It just was like a second home. So that was the experience of the drop-in center. It was like going to your living room. And you just would, whatever's going on. You never knew what was going to be going on. Sometimes somebody would be in a certain state where others were talking to them or working stuff through, or even making decisions about whether somebody was in such a state that maybe they needed to go back to hospital for a while. Or maybe there were people who were brand new to town, and that was an amazing thing too. People started to use the MPA drop-in center that had nothing to do with mental patients. They just knew that it was a place where you could go and there'd be people to talk to and information to be accessed. And so for me, the drop-in center was almost a had to every day. days that I wasn't working or whatever, you just went to the drop-in. See if Kathy Batten and Owen want to play a game of Scrabble, and see if Lorraine wants to get a couple people together and go down to the beach, or see if Mike wants to some help to go down and do some banking and stuff because he didn't communicate so well with others, whatever it might be. But it was you could just go there and then just pick it up from there. So I say that drop-in center, that corner, and I know it wasn't just me. If I sat down, I could make a list of 50 or 60 people at least who I was a second home to. Oh yeah. And many people, some of whom have passed away now, who that was their main interface with the world. But done in such a good way. It's very hard now to give a feel for the vibrancy of it. It just had the feel of something going on. We had a little woodworking shop in the corner, and maybe you'd have somebody like Farron playing folk songs in there, and Patty and a couple others working on the nutshell over in that corner over there with stuff laid out and spread out, and Jerry and Jane in the office doing administrative stuff, and phones ringing, and that kind of thing, and people coming in and walking in and out and coming and going. A wonderful place, emotionally satisfying place. I can't imagine life in Vancouver in the 1970s without an MPA drop-in center.
I find it so interesting and really moving, really very moving, to think that it was so open and that other people, Avi Dolgan,
Yeah, right.
I think you met at last. He described it as one of the happening places, in a place in Kitts where you could go for a good conversation.
Yes, and I think this is important to know. It's important from my perspective. MPA, because we had a drop-in, a vibrant drop-in, a happening drop-in, a loud and busy drop-in, meetings and people coming and going. That drop-in was able to use its facilities being a couple of telephone lines and a desk and a couple of typewriters and whatever. We were able to help in ways big and small. I can't quantify it exactly, but MPA was helpful at least, and crucial sometimes, to the founding of Vancouver People's Law School, which is ongoing to this day, an important part of Vancouver's scene, has helped women and immigrants and poor people understand their legal rights, and it's just done an amazing job. But again, MP was one of the places where very, very early stage support was gotten, letters of support were written, connections were made. Kitsilano Neighborhood House, which continues to this day. It was in the same neighborhood because MPA had already established certain connections with the funding agency at the City of Vancouver, and knew people. We could again write letters of support and help them get going. Downtown Eastside Residents Association, a crucial part of Vancouver's political history. MPA Health, Pine Free Clinic on 4th Avenue. The list just goes on and on. So to say it was an MPA drop-in, what you have to understand, it wasn't, just some little room where a few ex-mental patients gathered and, just stared at each other and whatever. It was not like that at all. It was like some combination of and I've been involved in politics, it was like the most exciting campaign war room that any political party ever set up. It was like the best cocktail party reception you ever went to, or the best public reading, literary fest, because, as I say, there was all kinds of ferment going on, and including just that, like literary stuff. People who would be writing something while they were sitting in the drop-in, and maybe the next day reading what they had written, whether that was poetry or Other people might have been rambling, but it was the creativity. It was that sense of you just never knew what you were gonna find when you got there, but you knew something was gonna be going on. There was gonna be friendly faces. There was gonna be people that mattered and made things matter. So, yeah, it would be difficult for somebody who hadn't really experienced it to let them know what a vibrant, alive place that MPA Drop-In Center was.
That's great. I'm just looking at the time, and I should make a phone call, but is there a topic that we haven't touched on? I wanted to talk to you about funding, and we talked about that. Participatory democracy, we certainly
That
really
to me,
good.
that is, and hopefully, as you try and tell this story now,
Such
that,
responsibility.
well, but again, and we all, you and I certainly are aware of it, but the National Film Board film that was made in the 70s
Yes.
itself, the one reason that such a large part of that film uses the meetings as a background, as a, for explaining the organization, because that democracy, that open, come in and you can vote. There was no membership cards, there was no screening process, there was no blackballing of this person,
Yeah.
and nobody ever took control of MPA. That's another thing. I've been involved in a lot of different groups, and occasionally, there's a couple of loudmouths who eventually kind of take over and start running everything or whatever. It was never like that with MPA. It was always a variety, a wide spectrum of voices. Everybody was heard. Not an easy process sometimes. There was some very emotionally trying meetings because these were important issues that were being discussed. But again, like I say, what I remember is it was come one, come all. If you showed up at the meeting, it was assumed that you were a member, that you were interested, you got a vote, and of course, from some people's point of view who like something a bit more structured, that was problematic. But it was, along with that drop-in center, it was part of the glory of MPA, that slightly chaotic ferment. You just never knew what was going to come up from that process. And so consequently, a lot of really good, unexpected things happened. And people who didn't even know they had it in them, you could see that. People would stand up at a meeting, they'd be very shy and stuff, they'd get talking. And because the group was so inviting, because people were looking at them, encouraging them to talk, they would be amazed at how much sense they made. I remember that a couple of times, people going, I can't believe that I said that. And I go, and you were so eloquent and whatever. And they would express it, well, it was because I felt totally open. Because that's a subtle process, you're standing, you're putting yourself out there. It only takes one or two people to kind of, look at you to shut you down or intimidate you from speaking. That just didn't happen at MPA. So we heard from people who didn't get heard from otherwise. Yeah. And it's, I wish now that we had been better maybe at recording some of that kind of stuff. But in my mind, I always will remember that wonderful feeling that we're part of something that's going on. Not even exactly clear on what it is exactly, but something very good is happening here. And that was a feeling you walked away from that meeting, that you left with that feeling like, oh, that was interesting. That was good.
It's been so good. Arthur, I looked so hard for you last spring. It's so fortuitous that you actually ended up finding us on the project. This is brilliant. Thank you.
Go take a break. I have to use the washroom.
Yeah, I'm desperate to go to.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm gonna try to make my phone call. But just wait. There may be. Just let me just see if I can pause this thing. How do I do that? There must be a way. Why don't you just go?
Yeah, I will find a washroom.
There is a washroom. There. Okay.
Ooh, it's 12:22. I have a physio appointment at 2:30 that I have to get back over to.
Okay, so maybe we should just stop this.
Okay.
Of course, I don't. I wanted you to talk a bit about work up at Riverview that MPA did.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there was an evolution in the relationship between MPA as an organization and the Riverview Hospital. And I wasn't there in the earliest days, but I know that it took a while for the people at Riverview Hospital to A, get to know anything at all about MPA, and through a gradual process begin to understand that MPA was there to be a positive alternative, a positive community-based place that patients could turn. So that evolution began, and there was a number of threads. One, MPA members were going out to Riverview to do review panels, which is the process where a patient could apply for release, and there's a 3-person panel, one of whom is designated as the patient's representative or spokesperson. So that was one way that the relationship started. MPA members, sometimes ex-patients, would go and play that role of the patient's advocate in a review panel. And we were also going out to Riverview for social occasions. There would be, let's say, an open house type day at Riverview. So some of our ex-patients who are now in the community wanted to go back out to the hospital. We had a transport vehicle, a kind of a 9-person van, so we could go. So essentially by 1975, 1976, the Riverview administration had become much more comfortable with who MPA was and what we were doing. And then there were arrangements made from there where we actually had a presence at the hospital. There was a space given to MPA so that we could have a drop-in center at the hospital. And of course, through that interaction, MPA was now in a position to start to let patients who were in hospital know about us, know that we were there, know that they could make use of MPA if that suited their get out of hospital type of plan. And we were able to start reaching out to people in the hospital. So as I say, the hospital gave us some space to use for that drop-in center. We were having more and more occasions on which MPA members would be going out to the hospital to either do review panels, just straightforward visitation. But it all helped to make it kind of a seamless process so that people, as I say, in the hospital and staff at the hospital too, were becoming increasingly aware of who is MPA, what do we do? Oh, they have houses. Oh, they have a drop-in center. They have these particular programs. So staff were able to help patients when they were making their plan for what's going to happen to you when you're getting out. And then the most, to my mind, most useful part of that came about when we were able to now reach out to patients when they were still in the hospital and get it all lined up so that we knew what house they were going to be able to move into of MPAs. So there was no, worry. And so as a person, and this made it much easier doing the review panels for, let's say, myself as the patient's representative. When the question always came up, it was a standard question at a review panel. Well, addressing this to the patient, what's your plan? If you get out, what plan do you have? And sometimes if a patient didn't have a plan, that might be an argument for you're not quite ready to get out. So by being able to go in and do the panel, represent the patient and say, we have a plan. The plan is this person is going to move into one of the MPA homes, and they're also going to be able to access MPA's other services by using whether that might be the woodworking shop at the drop-in center, or they're going to be able to access some of the programs we had, which would be as simple as helping people learn how to bank and shop and do basic cooking. Anyway, we were able to now offer that package. So it was to my mind, it was a two-way street in that we were getting to know the Riverview people more and more. They were getting to know who MPA was, and by getting rid of some of the misunderstandings or myths that both sides might have had, we were able to be much more effective for the people that counted, which was the people who were in Riverview at the time. So it did become it changed from being, let's say in the earliest days, a somewhat adversarial relationship. And it became and evolved into one of a very cooperative relationship of both of us recognizing, look, what we're trying to do here is be of use and help to these people, the psychiatric patients. So by doing that, I think we not only made the situation better for the patients coming out, we were able to spread the word. More and more people got to know who we were. So that's how the process played out from my point of view. But certainly by the mid to late 70s, MPA had very much a presence at Riverview itself, as I say, from the drop-in center, and you would go out there and you would see copies of the Nutshell, or you would see notices on a board about an upcoming MPA meeting, that sort of thing. Very positive change.
That's great. It's a wrap. That's good.